Hey friends, welcome back to Guess What? Compliance can be simple. I'm your host, Dr. Natasha Guess, and today we are talking about something I see constantly across healthcare practices of all sizes. And that is what I call the audit anxiety trap. This is a cycle where fear of audit starts driving compliance decisions, and oftentimes it makes things worse instead of better. Now, before we begin, I just want to give you a quick reminder. This episode is for education and compliance awareness only, not legal advice. Okay, so what does the audit anxiety trap look like? Audit anxiety often shows up quietly before it becomes obvious. For instance, a practice hears about an audit from a colleague, or they read a headline that says, oh, CMS or state auditors, they're doing something today. Or they receive a payroll request, and suddenly it all feels urgent. One example that I see consistently is a practice. They get that audit engagement letter. They start to rewrite multiple policies at once without considering whether staff can realistically follow them. And then, on paper, everything looks stricter, but in reality, the workflow, it breaks down. Another example is over-documentation. The notes get longer, your templates get more complex, and then staff feels pressure to document defensively rather than accurately. And that is what the audit anxiety trap looks like. One of the most important things that I do want you to understand about audits is this. Regulators are not looking for perfection. They are not expecting flawless documentation. They are not expecting zero mistakes. And they're not expecting that your systems will never break down. What they are actually looking for are reasonable systems that are followed consistently. And that distinction matters because fear-based compliance pushes practices in the opposite direction. And when you let fear take over, compliance stops being about accuracy and it starts being about optics. Practices begin documenting what they think auditors want to see instead of what actually happens day to day. And that is where you can create risk. Auditors are trained to look for gaps. And I've said this time and time again. They are trained to look for gaps between what your policy says and what your practice actually does. And when your documentation no longer reflects reality, that gap becomes obvious very quickly to an auditor. Now, let me give you an example of what I see all the time. A practice has a written policy that says internal audits are reviewed monthly. And on paper, that sounds very strong. It looks proactive, but in reality, no one is actually performing those monthly reviews. There's no logs, no meeting notes, no corrective action, and no evidence of the policy being followed. That is another mismatch that creates far more risk than having a simpler policy that says audits are reviewed quarterly and you're actually doing them. Fear-based compliance often leads practices to overpromise on paper and undeliver in reality. And auditors notice that immediately. Another example of this shows up in staff training. A practice might document that all staff receive extensive annual compliance training that covers multiple regulatory topics. But When an auditor asks the staff basic questions about their workflows or policies, the answers are inconsistent or they're unclear. Again, the issue isn't that training wasn't perfect. The issue is that the documentation did not reflect what was realistically happening. And from an audit perspective, that looks like a lack of oversight, not a lack of effort. Fear also causes practices to delay addressing known issues. And I've heard this a lot. We know this isn't ideal, but we don't want to open a can of worms. What? The problem is that auditors do not penalize practices for identifying problems. They penalize practices for ignoring the problems. And a documented issue with a corrective action plan shows awareness and accountability. An undocumented issue that everyone quietly knows about looks like negligence when it surfaces. Now, in contrast, practices that take a calm, realistic approach to compliance tend to have fewer findings, even when issues exist. Why? Because their documentation actually matches reality. Their policies are definitely simpler, but followed. Their training is practical. It is not aspirational. And their corrective actions are incremental, not dramatic. That consistency builds credibility. And this is why fear-based compliance actually increases risk. It creates a compliance program that looks good on paper, but collapses under scrutiny. And auditors, they do not fail practices because they aren't perfect. Audits fail practices because their compliance story does not line up. And remember, the goal of compliance is not to eliminate every risk. The goal is to be able to clearly explain what you do, why you do that, and how you monitor to improve over time. When compliance is driven by fear, the story becomes impossible to tell. When it is driven by realism and consistency, audits become far more manageable. Now, this is exactly the type of issue we work through inside my Compliance Support Hub. In the hub, we focus on replacing fear-based reactions with calm, repeatable compliance habits. And you can join the Compliance Support Hub at guestcomplianceconsultantllc.com/compliance support hub. Now, back to the topic of hand. What does a healthier approach to audits look like? And I get that question a lot. And a healthier approach starts with documenting what actually happens day to day in your practice. Your training should reflect real workflows, not your ideal scenarios. You have to ensure that you are addressing all of your gaps. Addressing gaps incrementally helps practices build confidence and sustainability. Now, I have a mini audit moment. You guys know I love to do this. Ask yourself this question. If you stop doing one compliance activity tomorrow, would anyone notice besides your written policy? If the answer is no, the policy is creating risk, not reducing it. Remember, audits are a part of healthcare. Preparation, not panic, is what protects practices long term. And when your compliance systems are built calmly, audits will become manageable. And all of the events pertaining to an audit, it will be so easy for you instead of you just rushing and feeling like you're in crisis mode. So why not prepare, review, Take a look at all of your documentation. Consistently look at one area and improve it. Until next time, keep it simple, keep it compliant, and take care of your patients.